there was never a time where we didn't need to study the teachings of Jesus, right? But I feel there's a particular need right now because I feel like we are not very attentive to the teachings of Jesus. Sometimes on the left and sometimes on the right and sometimes in the middle. We're doing everything other than paying attention to the teachings of Jesus. And the culture wars context has also got people oftentimes teaching and preaching about the hot button issues of the day, mainly.
Mhm.
And I wanted to instead let the teachings of Jesus set the agenda and then be properly disoriented by what he talked about.
Welcome to the Spirituality Podcast, a ministry of First Community Church here in Columbus, Ohio. And on this podcast, we talk about spirituality, faith, and social justice issues. My name is Reverend Seth Stearns. I'm the minister of Spiritual Life and Learning Center here at First Community. And my guest today is Reverend Dr. David Gushee. David Gushee is widely regarded as one of the most important Christian ethicists of the past 30 years through his prolific scholarship and his global influence. He's the author, co-author, or editor of more than 30 books, including works that have shaped classrooms and congregations across multiple continents. Kingdom Ethics, The Sacredness of Human Life, Introducing Christian Ethics, After Evangelicalism, and the landmark book, Changing Our Mind. I would also add to that, because we'll be talking specifically about these books, we'll be talking about the moral teachings of Jesus and defending democracy from its Christian enemies. His books have been translated internationally and continue to frame moral conversations well beyond U.S. contexts. His scholarship addresses the most urgent moral challenges of our time: democracy and political integrity, trauma and moral injury, LGBTQ plus inclusion in the church, human dignity, and the moral formation of Christian communities in the way of Jesus. He's currently a distinguished university professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University, home of the Fighting
Bears.
Bears. Okay, thank you. And chair in Christian social ethics at, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, I'll just call it Free University at Amsterdam. He is a widely sought after preacher, teacher, and commentator on religion and public life. David, welcome to the conversation. So glad to finally have a chance to speak with you.
I'm so glad to, Seth. It is good to be with you and your people.
Very good. So let's start off for folks who may not know, what is an ethicist?
An ethicist is a guide to the moral dimension of Christianity. Um, it's a, uh, it's a function that has been there since the beginning of the church. Anybody who teaches Christians about what it looks like to follow Jesus faithfully, who teaches about right and wrong, good and bad, um, is functioning in that role. The profession of Christian ethicist was born in the late 19th century in the university environment, especially to help Christians address the complex social problems associated with industrialization, urbanization, and all the problems associated with that.
Mm.
But so anyway, so you can get a PhD in Christian ethics from about 40 universities or seminaries, and then you get to, if somebody wants to hear from you, you get to teach and form Christian communities towards greater faithfulness.
Hmm. Very good. Well, it's probably kind of boring time for you right now with not much going on in the world.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
always very quiet in Christian ethics. In fact, one of the things I've always loved about this discipline is that we face moral challenges in this broken world all the time. And bringing the great Christian tradition into conversation with, what do we, as this says, March 10th, and what's going on March 10th, 2026 in our specific context, uh, you know, that that never gets old, and it's both dealing with unchanging traditions and dealing with constantly changing realities. So, never boring.
Mm, very good. And I've noticed you are on your Substack. You've been pretty verbal as of late with in response to the, I guess we'll call it a war in Iran.
Yeah, I have wrestled over the years with the best venue for communicating, in the public. I used to do, all the socials like Instagram and Twitter and so on, Facebook. I think Substack is I'm liking it as a venue for serious communication that I get to
Hmm.
control. It's not driven by somebody else's algorithm.
Hmm.
So I'm feeling pretty good about that. I would say that it it took me a little while to process another victory for our current president and what the challenges were going to look like in that. And to be honest, there was a bit of a stop the world, I'd like to get off, kind of vibe I had going for a little while, but the world doesn't stop and I'm not allowed to get off. And so I guess I've still got a responsibility. It's a calling. In fact, I
Hmm.
mean, to understand me more viscerally, I have felt called to be a Christian ethicist since I was 23 years old. That was 40 years
Hmm.
ago. So I've been doing this work for a long time or training for it. And I guess what I know about most Christian ethicists is that calling is very deep and it doesn't really go away until they breathe their last breath, which I haven't done
Hmm.
yet. So I'm
Okay.
still, I'm still in it.
Very good. Very good. So, what classes are you currently teaching?
Two classes right now. I do the Intro to Christian Ethics for seminary students here,
Mm.
and I'm doing a class based on the Moral Teachings of Jesus book that I understand you've been teaching through with some folks.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so that's what I'm doing this semester.
Okay. Very good. And not long ago, you became ordained in the Anglican Church.
Well, it's moving in that direction, though I'm not sure that it's gonna end up in ordination. We have a second home in England, and we're in a rural village, and they're putting me to work when I'm there, which is about 3 months a year.
Mm.
Putting me to work doing assisting in the liturgy and speaking in a section of England where there's far more churches than there are clergy. So they're letting me do everything other than Eucharistic ministry.
Mm.
Um, and it appears that immigration status concerns are going to keep me from being ordained, at least right now, which um, which is unfortunate. It wasn't my decision. It appears to be the Church of England's concern about that.
Mm.
So anyway, when we're there, last time we were there in February, I mean, I served in 7 different churches over 2.5 weeks, and so they're keeping me plenty busy.
Wow. Wow.
Um, I'm in an area where there are 13 churches and only 3 clergy. And so there's plenty of need. And when I'm there, I get to help serve, which is very meaningful. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. That's great. What's the within the Anglican Church in those in that community that you're in? How would you describe the theology? Is it fairly conservative?
It varies dramatically.
Hmm.
Um,
Across the churches there.
across the church. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things I've learned about Church of England is that they are a broad church, both with some historic distinctions, which are usually described as Anglo-Catholic versus evangelical versus kind of modern liberal,
Hmm.
right? Um, and those distinctions go back 150 years or 200 years. Um, but they're also dealing with the issues like LGBTQ inclusion and um, so on that are concerns for all the churches right now. And they, especially in the rural parts of England, people like if there is one functioning Church of England congregation in a community, then people will go there, and the clergy there have to serve the diversity of the people who will come.
Hmm.
So you can't have an Anglo-Catholic and an evangelical and a liberal church in, you know, Broadway or Blockley because there's just not enough population. So the clergy there learn to serve a diversely believing community that doesn't have a lot of options other than staying home, which of course many people choose to do. Um, I'd say one thing I'm learning there is there's a beauty about trying to stay in community, even with people you disagree with. And that's a value for them that is a stronger value than what I usually see in the U.S. church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We get used to arguing and leaving, and they can't really leave. And that is, if you want to stay in the Church of England, there's not really an alternative,
Mm-hmm.
not in most of these communities. So people learn to live in community with people they disagree with, and I think I'm learning from that. That's good for me. It's a good exercise for me to learn from that.
Yeah, yeah. There's something we can all learn from that,
Yeah,
from the difference from the states.
yeah,
Let's talk about the moral teachings of Jesus. So talk about how did you come to write the book, and well, what do you hear from people who when you go speak about the book?
yeah. Um, well, my best-selling book, other than Changing Our Mind, my best-selling book was a big old Christian ethics textbook called Kingdom Ethics.
Mm,
And that was with Glenn Stassen, and it was a textbook based on the Sermon on the Mount. And that was written over 20 years ago. This book, The Moral Teachings of Jesus, takes on a broader range of Jesus's teachings. I select 40 sayings from across the four Gospels. And if there are parallel texts, I compare the parallels. Um, and the reason I decided these are brief treatments, 3 or 4 pages, chapters. Uh, I decided that the church needs a fresh encounter with the actual teachings of Jesus.
mm,
Um, that's always called for. There was never a time where we didn't need to study the teachings of Jesus, right? But I feel there's a particular need right now because I feel like we are not very attentive to the teachings of Jesus. Sometimes on the left and sometimes on the right and sometimes in the middle. We're doing everything other than paying attention to the teachings of Jesus. And the culture wars context has also got people oftentimes teaching and preaching about the hot button issues of the day, mainly.
mm,
And I wanted to instead let the teachings of Jesus set the agenda and then be properly disoriented by what he talked about
mm,
and what he emphasized. Um, one other thought, I wrote this book after writing the book on democracy that we're going to talk about, I think, a little bit later.
mhm,
And you might say it also represented my sense that what the church needs is some deep formation in the way of Jesus. And that if something has gone wrong in American politics and culture, as I believe that it has, very wrong, then malformed Christians are playing a key role in having that happen. And so you mentioned earlier that I'm about the formation of Christians, and I know that's what your work is about too. I want to do what I can to improve the moral formation of Christians, and I can't think of anything better to do on that than to write about the teachings of Jesus.
mm. I really appreciate the fact that it's the type of book because each section is about 3 or 4 pages, and you cram a fair amount of content in those 3 or 4 pages. But it you I can read it and then I can sit with it,
Mhm.
and it I really enjoyed it from that perspective, and I think it makes it uh, challenging reading, but readable reading at the same time.
It was intended for regular folks, and to be something that people could easily read in a week and talk about in a Bible study class the next
Mm,
Sunday. Also as a tool for busy pastors who are trying to put sermons together. There's not a lot of wasted words in there, as you say. It's very concise, but a lot packed in. Um, I'm trying to serve the church. I'm trying to help Christians be properly formed. And if you're writing 40-page chapters with a lot of jargon, you're going to lose
Mm,
most regular people, you know.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's really where my heart is right now, is to write accessibly for regular people.
Okay. The other thing I really appreciated about the book, and I'd like to hear more about this, is the commentaries and the resources that you used were really diverse. And
Yeah,
so it wasn't just looking at the moral teachings of Jesus from a white male in
yeah.
America standpoint. Can you talk about some of the other commentaries that you leveraged?
Yeah, I'm actually sitting at my desk in my basement office with those books around me right now
Mm,
because I'm teaching a class on it. Amy Jill Levine, uh, her book on Jesus's parables. She's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament and a brilliant
mm,
one. And the Jewish annotated New Testament, which is, I'll show you. This is the Jewish annotated New Testament. It is, as it sounds like, a New Testament edited by Jewish scholars,
mm,
with lots of reference to rabbinic sources and so on. Um, and then there's Miguel de la Torre's Politics of Jesus. So it's a Hispanic liberationist reading of Jesus. And there's Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, which
mm,
was a very early kind of mystical Black liberation theology or reading. And then there's Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Discipleship. I think I've named them all. So one way I think about it is like the text is in the center. I actually I'll use this image with my students. Picture a table, and we're all sitting around the table. The scriptural text is in the center, but then around the center is these like 8 books. And so we are trying to have as much as possible a 360-degree angle of vision on the text and not just let Bible commentaries overwhelmingly written by white European and American men provide our only access point into the text. I didn't
mhm,
mention there's a women's Bible commentary that I also use. I don't think that's on the desk right now, and then 3 or 4 good commentaries about each biblical book. So yeah, I think that's a doable paradigm for preachers too. But I want people to be exposed to a wide set of lenses on the biblical text.
mhm. And so when you're out there teaching this and speaking on it, what do you hear from folks?
Yeah. Um, Often I've never heard that teaching before. I don't remember that one. Or I've never heard it taught that way before. Um,
So
or
for many people, this is new.
it's
This is
new,
new information.
even longtime churchgoers.
Mm.
Um,
What do you
you
make
know,
of that? I'm sorry to keep cutting you off, but
no, I just
I'm
think
really I'm
it's
intrigued by that.
surprising, actually. Like, take a passage we're going to be looking at next week in my class, the one where Jesus says it's in Matthew 10, don't fear anybody other than the one who can throw body and soul in hell. Only fear, basically, God, possibly Satan, if you read it that way, but don't fear people. All they can do is destroy the body. Um, and what I take out of that is Jesus is regularly teaching and modeling not to be afraid of people.
Mm,
And I don't know, I wonder how many average churchgoers would instinctively know that passage, right? Because it's not one of the main ones. It's not one of the ones that you would regularly hear preached. Um, the Gospels are packed with these sayings from Jesus, and I was kind of surprised at how many distinguishable, I call them like, well, pericopes or teaching nuggets, sayings that there are. And so I love seeing people like their light bulbs go off and they're like, wow, I didn't even know that passage was there. And
mm,
that really teaches me something, you know? Um, I emphasize that Jesus's teachings are both demanding and also liberating. Like he frees us from status seeking. He frees us from thinking that our security will be found in our possessions. He frees us from worries about other people's opinions of us. He frees us from holding grudges if we learn how to forgive, things like that. So I try to emphasize Jesus, the liberator, and Jesus knowing better than we know ourselves about how upside down our values are. And I think people find it bracing, challenging, and enticing, which is what exactly I think these teachings are.
Hmm. It seems that perhaps what happens too is folks will zero in on certain passages, and that's what they look at. That's what they look at and remember, and what holds meaning for them. And I think what your book does is say, well, that's fine, but don't forget about this one over here.
Yeah.
And let's look at some of these over here. Um, and I think your book does a wonderful job of that.
Thank you. 40 is a lot. I do think in the end it's manageable. But yeah, we need to pay attention to all of them, not just a handful of them. Um, so so yeah, I've had churches go through, you know, either in Sunday school classes, Bible study classes, or from the pulpit, every single one of the teachings. Imagine like 40 weeks. I mean, that's quite a diet of that. But I really think we could hardly do better than spend more time with the teachings of Jesus. So I'm getting a really good response. The sales are actually accelerating now, almost 2 years after the book came out. I think it's being discovered by more and more churches.
Mm. The other thing I would mention too is the discussion guide that was generated to help walk through that book was wonderful.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. One of my dear proteges developed that, and he is a pastor. He's one of the pastors who's used every chapter over the last 9 months. So
Mm,
he's a real gift. His name is Jeremy Hall. He's in Pittsburgh. He's a real gifted teacher and preacher himself.
yeah. I, please relate to him. I thought the discussion guide was just so well done and
That's
just a
great.
wonderful tool. The book is readable, but then with the discussion guide, it really helps to it helps to facilitate those conversations and thought about what the book is saying.
I'm really glad to hear that stuff. That's great. I'll tell him.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. So, has anyone said to you, as you're out there talking about the book, hey, why aren't you talking about LGBTQ plus issues in this book? What did Jesus have to say about that?
Hmm. No, nobody yet. Um, because he didn't say anything directly about it. I mean, there's the possibility that the reference to eunuchs in Matthew 19, 1 through 12 is applicable. It probably is applicable. But I think of it this way. You can you can say, here's the 10 hottest issues in American Christianity right now. And so the chapters will be one at a time on those issues. And then you look for biblical resources that might be relevant, right? Which is, in essence, how a lot of books are written. In this case, I said, let's look at what Jesus actually taught as we have them in the Gospels and let those teachings set the agenda.
Hmm,
And 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 then you might be surprised by the things that he prioritized versus the things that we prioritize.
hmm,
Yeah.
hmm,
So because there's not explicit teaching on that subject, the book never goes there.
hmm. Which is maybe a lesson in and of itself.
It may well be. Jesus talks so much about money and things associated with money, like status and philanthropy and self-dispossession of property and pride and greed and honor. Um, but we don't want to have a sermon series on those things. We'd rather, beat the culture wars issues gong again, and
Hmm,
so again, it's bracing for everybody. I actually think a book that challenges everybody across the ideological spectrum is actually very good for the church right now. And
Hmm.
Jesus does that. So, yeah. So I just let his teaching set the agenda for this book.
Okay. I'd like to pivot. Let's
Yeah.
go ahead and pivot to changing our mind. But is there anything else you want to say about the moral teachings of Jesus before we make that pivot?
No, I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about, for those folks who don't know about this book, can you talk about how this book came to be and what is it you wrote about?
Um, by the 2000s and early 2010s, um, at that point I was still identifying as an evangelical Christian, though moderate to progressive evangelical. And in the evangelical Christian community, there was a churning, and I wouldn't say so much a debate, but a debate as to whether to have a debate about LGBTQ plus inclusion. And same thing was true in my denomination, which at the time was moderate Baptist, uh, and which is not Southern Baptist because I had left them by then. Um, and every room I walked into, it was like people were having these side conversations about issues arising in their church, or about, man, we really need to talk about this, or how are we going to talk about this, or my parents are asking for resources on this, parents of gay kids, and I don't have anything, and I'm afraid of talking about it. Um, and I began to feel like, well, that sense of nagging calling. Somebody needs to do a serious dive on this from within the Baptist and evangelical communities.
Mm,
And but most people are afraid because if they say the wrong thing, they could lose their job, which is still true in a lot of places. So um, there were other elements to the backstory. My youngest sister came out as a lesbian in her 30s, and so that was a personal consideration. I was teaching at a seminary which had openly gay students. I was at a church that had openly gay members. Um, a lot of them deeply wounded by rejection in the church and in their families in the past or in the present. So by 2014, I felt somebody needs to do this. Maybe I need to do this.
mm,
Um, I was pretty confident I wouldn't get fired because of the way academic freedom works at my school. And my church was a supportive community and wasn't going to kick me out. So I said, I have the freedom, I have the opportunity, I have the obligation. So I decided to write the book. And I hoped that it would be a an occasion for evangelical Christians to, I don't know, to resource that conversation in that community. And that happened some, but mainly what happened was rejection of the very idea. And then I was kind of kicked out of that subculture, which
mm,
is kind of the rest of the story for my journey, but
mhm,
that's a different question. Yeah.
mhm. So talk about the trajectory of the book. What was it? What was it? Because it almost felt like you were sort of thinking it through
It was.
in the book. And so kind of talk about maybe where you started with that and where you found yourself going as you wrote the book.
Well, where the venue helps to understand it. I had a column for the Baptist media. It was called Associated Baptist Press. And so I had the freedom to write weekly for them or more often. So the chapters began as essays in Associated Baptist Press, one per week, and started in the spring of 2014. And I decided to take this issue from the ground up. Um, you know, again, attempting to help Christians think about this issue, a fair amount of defining of terms, um, clarifying that the church has a problem here, that we have um, a conversation that needs to happen that we're not equipped for, carrying. people on a journey, partly what it was, a journey from ignorance to being better informed, but also a journey from hardline rejectionism to more Christ-like attitudes. So I use the image of uh like bus stops. Like can we get so far as agreeing that the church pulpit should not be a place for bashing LGBTQ people? Okay. If we can get there, great. If that's as far as you're willing to go right now, okay. And then I said, let's say you're willing to go to the next step. Can we agree that the church should be a place where all people are welcome, including LGBTQ people? Can you get there with me? Okay, good. All right. Can we agree that the church should be a place where LGBTQ people could be allowed to serve in volunteer roles? Um, why or why not? Okay, can you get there? Okay. And then kind of can we be open to reconsidering the traditional idea that there's something sinful about same-sex relationships? Can we explore that? Can we look back at the passages that have been cited? You can? Okay, good. So then I went through the passages, you know. Um, can we wrap our minds around the idea that some of the things we thought we knew, we don't really know, that they were misbegotten elements of tradition? Um, can we think of this as more like other times where we changed our mind because we realized we had something wrong, as opposed to the narrative that we're compromising our values to be politically correct? And by the end, I was thinking it through as I was writing it. You've got the right feel. That's what was going on. By the end, I, it was almost like I surprised myself. Like, what happens if we get to the place where we conclude that our rejection of LGBTQ plus people is more like when Christians supported biblical anti-Semitism, when Christians supported slavery, when Christians argued from scripture for women's subordination? And if it's like that, can we conclude that maybe we need to abandon this teaching like we abandoned those teachings? And what would it look like to build church on the other side of that tradition? What would we do now? And in the end, what we would do is we would celebrate that we had left behind an aspect of tradition that harmed people and that wasn't in keeping with the best insights of Christian ethics. And we could now build a community in which everybody was included. I think I used this language at one point. You arrive at the sunlit plain in which you look around and no longer are you hindered by the shadows of rejection. Um, something like that. Um, there was a late addition to the book, which was when I had the amazing privilege of going to the Reformation Project meeting in Washington in the fall of 2014 and writing a talk there in which I compared the history of Christian homophobia to the history of Christian anti-Semitism and made the argument that we need to leave this behind. We need to leave both of them behind, you know?
Mm.
Um, so it's a step-by-step argument. What people tell me about that book, which is now sold tens of thousands of copies and is used all over the world, is for LGBTQ plus people themselves, they'll say, this helps me to accept myself. This helps me to understand why that harmful teaching was believed by my parents and by my church and by myself, maybe, and why it's really okay to leave this behind. And it's also a book that is handed to a lot of pastors, youth ministers, and parents to try to help them reconsider. In fact, Seth, on Monday of this week, I had a chance to be chaplain of the day for the Georgia legislature. You saw that, right?
I saw that. I saw
Yeah.
that.
And the guy who introduced me, Representative Sam Park, Minority,
I heard what he
wasn't
said.
that amazing,
It
Seth?
was amazing. It was amazing. But go ahead,
Minority
share.
Whip. Yeah.
Yeah.
He said, he's a minority whip of the Georgia legislature, Georgia House. He said that is the book he was able to talk through his own homosexuality with his dying mother, his
Mm,
devout mother. And they were able to come to a reconciliation and acceptance before she died.
mm,
And I didn't get to see the look on his face because I was behind him. But I know that it was very moving. It was very, very moving. I hear that kind of thing all the time. I would say that book is the book of mine that has had the most transformative impact on lives.
hmm
Yeah, it's unbelievable. You know, when you're
And
writing, I could not have anticipated it really, you know?
and there's a kindness and a gentleness to it too, because as you were talking about, well, if you can we get to this level? And to your point, some can't go beyond that, and so they stabilize at whatever level, and you invite them to the next, but there's no there's no negativity or a sense of spirit of being an adversary on the issue. But there's this invitation that you extend to, okay, so if you can do this, what about this next level? You know, you're willing to just give this some thought. And it's again the term invitation really comes to mind in
I
terms
think
of
that's a
what you're
fair
extending.
reading. That's a fair reading, Seth. And to be honest, I mean, in the heat of debate, I haven't always been as nice as that,
Mm,
right?
right.
Especially once the arguments and the hatred began flowing towards me and the rejection, because it hurts, right?
Mm,
But I think the book, part of why it works is that it does have that kind of tone. And like, so picture the parent who can't get past the theology that they were raised in. You might say that maybe one time they read it and they can get as far as chapter three, and then maybe the next time they read it and well, maybe, okay, maybe chapter
mm,
five. In other words, they can make progress on the journey, and all such progress is progress towards a more humane church and a more humane world and less hurt,
mm,
right? The fewer pastors we have spewing anti-gay rhetoric from the pulpit, the better. If that happens, that's progress.
mm,
It's not as much progress as parents who, when their child comes out, they say, I love you just the way you are. I understand that this is just part of the diversity of God's good world, and I'm going to go on this journey with you happily and without stigma.
mm,
That's better than that's further along the journey. But each step along the journey is a good step. It's good progress.
mm.
So the book does keep an invitational tone, I think. And maybe there's a lesson in that. People don't respond well to being berated. I think they respond better to being invited.
Yeah, I can. I don't know if anyone has changed their mind because they were berated,
Right.
but many people have changed their mind because they were invited.
Yeah. I think the book does that. So thanks for noticing that.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and thank you for writing the book because I know it from what I've read, it came with some personal costs to you.
More than I anticipated. I lost friends. I lost status. I lost invitations. I lost contracts.
Mm,
I lost speaking appearances. I lost a place in the evangelical world. Um, but I gained much more than I lost.
mm,
I gained the trust of a lot of wounded, especially young people who did not have good experiences with their churches, their youth ministries, their college ministries, or even their parents, who, when they read the book, found some healing and maybe reached out to me personally. Back in the day when I had all the socials, people would reach out to me on direct message on every means that there was.
mm,
I was inundated with communications and stories. Um, Took years off my life because there was so much sadness in it, right?
mm,
But there was also, thank you for telling me that I'm okay. Thank you for telling me that God loves me. I mean, that's pretty intense ministry there, Seth, you know?
And
So,
so needed. So,
yeah.
so needed. So, yeah.
So
Thank
that
you.
happened basically 10 years of that, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and still some today.
We'll include the link to the uh, Georgia Senate, right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Georgia House of Representatives. Yeah.
Georgia House of Representatives with the introduction when the person who introduced you that it was I when I opened the link and watched it, I thought, oh well, okay, we'll see what David's up to, doing this. But that introduction just blew me away.
Yeah. I mean,
What a powerful
yeah.
testimony that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you never know. You just, to those who, think about writing, when you write something, you never know what it's going to do
Mm,
because you lose control of it. You give it away to the world and, uh, and maybe God will do something good with it. I think that's happened with that book. So,
hmm. Yeah, sure has. Sure has. Well, let's talk about one more,
okay.
since we're talking books, defending democracy from its Christian enemies. So, what was on your mind when you wrote that one?
Um, well, most immediately, January 6th, 2021,
Mm,
and the Christian flags and the Christian prayers and the Christian rhetoric of a significant chunk of the people who were in the Capitol and around the Capitol that day. So picture that as a symbol, right? Jesus saves. Um, Jesus is my savior. Trump is my president. Flags. Um, but more broadly, everything that got us to that moment. Um, so the narrative that I tell is that a significant chunk of the American population and of the American Christian population and of the American evangelical Christian population in particular followed their cultural and moral and religious frustrations with the liberalizing of American society over the last 60 years as they see it, right over the cliff with Donald Trump. One way I tell the story is that from the 60s through 2020, conservative American Christians who believed that the culture was heading the wrong direction tried all kinds of strategies to change the direction of the society, including participating in the electoral process to to win elections and such. But that Trump had and still has an anti-democratic impulse, an authoritarian, anti-constitutional impulse that should have been a bright red line for Christians. We should have, and many Christians did, even conservative Christians who became never Trumpers, they were able to realize, I sure would like this or that thing to happen, but not at the cost of democracy itself.
mm,
Um, and so Trump was already sending authoritarian signals from the moment he began running for president, but it took a whole different level after the November election that he lost and the denial of the election results, and then January 6th. And then 4 years of nurturing kind of authoritarian dreams, and then he gets reelected. So the Christian enemies of the title, and I realize it's provocative, the Christian enemies are of democracy in the book title are people who, in the end, chose their cultural grievances and their loyalty to Trump over American constitutionalism. Um, and and now we are where we are,
mm,
right? The question as to whether our democratic system will hold is still up for grabs. Um, you know, so the book compares the U.S. Christian turn towards an authoritarian leader with other countries where the same thing has happened, and then also surveys resources from Christian tradition that should reinforce an older commitment to democracy, constitutionalism, the rule of law. And the comparative work with the other countries, which include Russia, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, and 19th and early 20th century France and Germany, is pretty bracing, I think. Um, the formula is something like this, Seth. A historic majority Christian population finds itself bewildered by unwelcome social changes and unable to make the changes go away. Such a population may be enticed by a demagogue who has authoritarian tendencies if he promises them the victories that they have not been winning through other means. That's the story that I tell in the book. And I
Mm,
think that story still reads, I mean, I think it rings true. I think that's where we are.
mhm, mhm. What have you heard from folks about the book? What kind of feedback have you gotten?
Um, the one interesting reception has been in Europe. The book began as my inaugural address as the Amsterdam ethics professor, the title that you mentioned at the beginning. And since 2021, when I gave that inaugural address, right-wing, sometimes quote unquote Christian political movements have been growing in Europe and in the UK. So a lot of historians and sociologists and theologians who are working on religion and politics in Europe have been reading the book and telling me that they appreciate it and that it speaks to their reality too.
Mm,
So that's one response. Um, for a lot of people, the paradigm that hardened left-right cultural divisions um, that divide a society for decades. Um, and we've all lived that. We've lived that for 50, 60 years, that could yield a kind of a earthquake of populism, of authoritarianism, saying, by golly, we need to solve this by any means necessary. In other words, it provides a way of making sense of what has changed versus what has stayed the same.
mm,
The cultural resentment stays the same. The left-right binary stays the same. The not being able to talk to your in-laws at the dinner table because they're on the other side of the cultural fence. That's so many people's experience, right? But the idea that we might sacrifice democratic norms to to win those culture wars once and for all, that's new.
mm.
So
And
people say,
frightening,
okay,
and
and
absolutely
frightening,
frightening.
very frightening. Yeah. So that makes sense. That makes sense to people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so it
So,
also is a way of not attacking one party. You can say, this is not about John McCain or Mitt Romney
mm,
or George W. or George H.W. or Ronald Reagan, because they were all operating within democratic norms. Trump is different.
mm,
And a lot of the people, like Mike Pence, knew the difference.
mm,
That's why he wouldn't go along, and that's why, everything happened to him, right? It's the difference between Mike Pence and Donald Trump. It's the difference between John McCain and Donald Trump. Um, but it's also the difference between a party and a population that has radicalized to such an extent that they're willing to let the authoritarian take control. Yeah.
we'll try this question. What do you think the lesson is for liberalism in this?
If you mean like the progressive side, the left leaning, well, one is sometimes and I'll put myself as a progressive. I voted Democrat most of my adult life, right? So, um, sometimes we have not been able to draw a proper distinction between people who care about democratic norms and people who don't. And it's a different game when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't care about democratic norms. In other words, the undifferentiated bashing of the conservatives has actually not prepared us well to be able to tell the difference of a different kind of movement.
Hmm.
Okay. Also, we need to listen to the narrative on the right, and part of their narrative is that we turned authoritarian first. And how we turned authoritarian was as liberal values began to prevail in many sectors like higher education and the entertainment sector, um, some parts of the judiciary, maybe many government bureaucracies, that we began culturally shoving those values down the throats of people who didn't share them and making canceling people or making people feel stupid or small if they didn't quite come to our values the way that we did, or even or say it the way that we did. Um, Maybe you've had this experience. I've had it, not being quite exactly right in terms of what the standards of discourse or whatever are, or standards of value for every single liberal cause of the moment. You don't say it quite right, or you don't embrace it quite right. So, in other words, we are accused of being authoritarian culturally, and their response is to be authoritarian politically.
Hmm.
And it isn't just culturally, because if you take the most liberal states, the accusation would be that some of the most liberal states that are deep blue from the top down have been mandating left values on a significant minority who doesn't want them. And that creates resentment.
Hmm.
And not just mandating values, but sometimes acting as if people who hold to the older values are like evil or stupid. And I think that's an accusation that all of us who would identify as progressive need to examine ourselves as to whether we've done that.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes it is like that. I've certainly seen it in higher education. Um, if authoritarianism breeds authoritarianism, and if we've played a role in this, we need to repent that and back off from that.
Hmm.
And also, we've had a fair amount of we don't talk to or listen to the other side because they're so wrong. So we don't read their books and we don't dialogue with them and we don't invite them to speak because they're just so wrong. And I think that actually left a significant chunk of the progressive side unprepared to even have any idea what was happening on the right. You know, as an example, we didn't know how influential Charlie Kirk had become, what a voice he was for millions of conservative Americans, and what the impact of his killing would be on people. We didn't know.
Hmm.
Um, so we have to get out of our own silos and listen better.
Hmm. That's a great entryway to ask you this question, I think, which is, so what's your vision of the church right now?
Well, above all, the church is the one community on the planet committed to following Jesus. We don't expect it of government. We don't expect it of um, Kroger. We don't expect it of any other community, but we should expect it of ourselves that this is a community pledged to following the way of Jesus. And so, if that's our pledge, then we will be serious about studying and working on living that out. That's the church.
Hmm.
Um, I do think that that has the implication that we're going to engage our neighbors with love, with forgiveness, with compassion, with mercy, um, with justice. Um, and we're going to be able to avoid the passions of the moment that would make us mean hateful, judgmental, um, or authoritarian. So a community pledged to following Jesus, nourished in the way of Jesus whenever we gather, fed on the Eucharist, fed on the Word, fed with the power of the Holy Spirit to be a better version of ourselves, able to bring those resources to bear in our own lives, but also in the communities that we live in, um, and bringing a different kind of spirit into every room we enter. Um, more than merely culture warriors, right or left, more than merely Americans, um, but followers of Jesus or people who are trying to follow Jesus and practicing at that. I use the imagery of practicing a lot. Baseball was my sport growing up, Seth,
Mm.
and I'm wearing my Atlanta Braves pullover today. I still wish the Braves would call me up to pitch for them. Okay, it's not too late.
Make it happen.
It could
Make it
happen, right?
happen.
So as a pitcher, I practiced so long and hard that craft of being a pitcher. I was a left-handed pitcher.
Mm.
Here's how you do everything as a pitcher. We practiced at 10,000, 20,000 reps. It's not a bad image. I think followers of Jesus who are practicing to get good at following him. And we do that through repetition, including failing and trying again. We learn how to forgive. We learn how to not be greedy. We learn how to love our neighbors. We learn how to not be afraid of people. We learn how to be humble. We learn how not to be status seeking. We learn how to keep our promises and tell the truth. People like that, it's hard to be against that,
Mm.
but you have to learn how to be that way. Culture war Christianity of left and right has distorted our witness. So I want the church to refocus on Jesus, who is supposedly the center of our faith. And then, of course, the cross as well here in Lent. I mean, so much is meant by the cross, so much could be learned at the cross, but part of it is that suffering love is at the center of our faith, not triumphant battle, but suffering love. And that suffering love is redemptive, or can be. And so I'm just wanting us to fall in love with Jesus again and with his way.
Mm. That's a beautiful vision. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Seth.
So what are your current wonderings? What are your growing edges right now? Is there another book in the works? What are you thinking about?
Um, well, at one level, I'm watching daily to see if our democracy will hold and what will happen in the meantime. I'm one thing I'm kind of watching the formation of mid 21st century America, realizing how old I am because I have a memory of essentially mid 20th century America. And like, wow, okay, you're getting old. I'm watching the next generations come along and seeing how they're being formed, and trying to help form them. Um, I'm in a big burst of writing right now that just won't quit. I have a book on Job coming out in September, and I've decided to do a sequel to this Moral Teachings of Jesus book called The Moral Teachings of the Prophets. And I'm going to do a collection of my sermons also. So, um, and there are other ideas. So the vocation of teaching, writing, and preaching remains strong. Uh, and I'm very passionate about my calling. Uh, it's about how much my energy will hold up under this intercontinental, multi-vocation kind of life that I'm living right now. So as you can hear, as there are readers or listeners would have heard, I have responsibilities in England, in Amsterdam, and in Atlanta. And then I'm on the road a lot. And so I have preaching, teaching, and writing and speaking but man, it's just all so fulfilling. Not to mention three kids and three grandkids, and um, you know, so many other things. But I'm trying to help the church be more faithful. I'm especially drawn to work with people on the other side of evangelicalism that began as the LGBTQ exiles, who had been booted out of their families and churches, but by now it's the broader millions who, for one reason or another, are on the other side of evangelicalism, like I am, and need ministry and
Mm.
resources and pastoring. So most of my writing is pitched towards them right now.
Okay. Who are you reading right now that is challenging you?
James Baldwin.
Mm.
I'm reading a lot of James Baldwin. Um, I I'm reading a huge biography of Baldwin by Nicholas Boggs. I'm reading. I'm looking at my stacks of books right now. Okay, I've got books on American culture and politics and kind of where we are. There's all kinds of books coming out. I'm looking at a book called When the Clock Broke that is about kind of how things changed in the 90s. This author, John Gans, pitches the problem to the 90s. Um, and books about cultural alienation in America. And then I have a stack of books on Job because I'm trying to keep reading deeply in Job. By the way, preview, I see Job as a paragon, truthful protest, even if it costs you your place in the community. I get
Mm.
that. That's what I think Job is about to some extent. I'm reading Isaiah Berlin, the political philosopher, for the first time right now. Um, and learning a lot from reading him. Um, so I have a reading program. Also, my wife and I run a classic book club. So right now I'm reading John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. So at all times we have a novel going, usually a current project book, something in American culture, something in biography. I'm reading a biography of Frank Sinatra right now just for fun. And I'm always endorsing books too or reviewing them. So reading is I mean, I don't have as much time to read as I would like, but those are my categories of reading anyway.
Wonderful. David, I have really appreciated this conversation. I've appreciated hearing not only about the books, but your process, your struggles, your experiences. It has been just a joy. Thank you for taking time for this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Seth. I like a good, unhurried conversation, and I feel like this has been a great one. So thank you.